left off at roughly? We ended up talking about theories of economic, well, we talked somewhat about theories of economic development. Remember Rothschild stages of growth? And dependency theory, world systems theory?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's some other stuff I put on there, but it's not mandatory by the curriculum. So 7.6, trade in the world economy. So the global economy is far more complex and interconnected it is than it was 50 years ago. Before World War II, most countries mostly produced their own stuff, and they didn't trade nearly as much as they did with other countries as before. As you can see, since the end of World War II, global trade as a percent of GDP has increased dramatically. So large free trade organizations such as the EU, Mercosur, and other free trade organizations have developed over time, and global trade volumes have risen dramatically, leading to interdependence. Now, there is one crucial thing that I would like to note. About 60% of these global trade volumes are not final products. They are called intermediary goods. They are inputs for other products. They're inputs to production. So like for instance, we're talking about a car, you may import or export just individual tires for the car. So that's not considered a final good. You cut that out, right? Okay, comparative advantage. Countries will produce and export whichever goods they can produce at the lowest opportunity cost. So simply put, some countries are better at producing things than others. I'll give you an example. It's probably a lot easier to grow tobacco in Virginia than it is to grow it in Alaska, for obvious reasons. Countries export what they are good at producing and import the rest. So trade between countries leads, in this case, to both sides gaining. Complementary advantage is when the comparative advantage of countries complement each other, leading to increased trade volumes. An example of that could be something like a country has a comparative advantage in iron, and another one has a comparative advantage in, I don't know, let's say the steel industry. So the raw materials of iron get exported to the country that produces steel. So the best way that I can explain opportunity cost is imagine you have two products. You can either produce 10 of one, 10 of product A, 5 of product B. In this instance, or yeah, let's say 5 of product B. In order to increase production of one good, you have to decrease production of the other good. So opportunity cost is just saying what you have to give up. So countries produce what they have the lowest opportunity cost, whichever they have to give up the least of. Just think about countries produce what they're good at. So can anyone name a comparative advantage of, let's say, South Korea? What?
They export a lot of technology, I think.
Yeah, technology. Samsung, that's a major case. Germany, let's say Japan. The auto industry. Mitsubishi, Toyota. Germany's also cars, Volkswagen, Porsche. And the United States, it's not as clear, but we have a comparative advantage in capital goods, in the insurance industry and the financial industry. Capital goods are goods that are used to produce other goods. So neoliberalism. So in modern day political terminology, this term is basically a political slur to mean anything that you don't like. But in terms of like what it roughly means is those who believe economic policies that promote free market reforms such as deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. And think about the Washington Consensus, which I covered a little bit earlier. That's kind of like the epitome of those reforms. And so neoliberals want the world to become more interconnected. They want to see more trade between countries, and they want to see more greater influence of market forces. So IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. They are an international organization that promotes financial stability, economic growth, and trade between countries. They usually assist countries' ongoing balance of payments issues, debt crises, and currency issues. All these problems, by the way, are pretty much interrelated to each other. And the bailouts that they give, so let's say a country is dealing with a debt crisis. So they have a lot of debt to do, they're on the brink of default, and no creditor is willing to give them additional money. The IMF may come in and say, okay, we'll lend you money in order to meet your debt payments, and we'll also help negotiate to restructure your debt. However, though, with these bailouts that we'll give you, we're also going to tell you that you want to make certain changes. So these bailouts come with strings attached, and these strings attached usually come in the form of you need to increase your tax, you need to increase taxes, you need to decrease spending, you need to remove trade barriers on the overall economy. Usually you need to gut your welfare programs and social assistance programs as well. Usually those reforms come in that sense. And the purpose of these reforms is to put the country on solid financial footing and to promote long-term economic growth. That's the intent, at least. So the World Bank is an international financial institution, grants governments loans in order to assist with economic development and poverty reduction. And they usually focus on countries that are not in an ongoing financial crisis. So think of the World Bank as, because they both lend money, the IMF and the World Bank both do, but think IMF as, okay, this is when there's a crisis going on. World Bank is just more like, hey, how can we help alleviate poverty? So international organizations and free trade. So international organizations such as the IMF, World Bank, WTO stands for World Trade Organization, and EU all promote free trade. Free trade, that means that individuals and companies can trade freely without much interference from the government. That means usually that there's less regulations, there's less tariffs. Tariffs are just a tax on imported goods. There are no quotas or anything of that nature. Just note this. Individuals and companies conduct almost all their international trade. Governments do not conduct a lot of international trade. When we talk about trade agreements, a trade agreement does not look like, oh, we'll sell you 50 bananas if you sell us a car. That's not how they work. The way trade organizations work is that they have the rules for trade saying, these are the tariffs on these products, these are the regulatory standards that you're going to be upheld to, and stuff like that. There's no set amount on, oh, you have to import this much, we have to export this much, so there may be quotas.
And what are these organizations called?
Supranational organizations.
Okay, supranational.
So OPEC is an organization of petroleum exporting countries. It's an international organization that basically controls the supply of oil. So they're like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, countries that have a lot of oil. And they'll basically meet up and they'll discuss, because they all have nationalized oil companies, so the oil industry is directly controlled by the government in these countries. And they will meet up and they will decide, do we want to cut production of oil, do we want to increase our production of oil? And that affects the global price of crude oil. So essentially, there was called a cartel, where they have a large they have a control over a large amount of oil, and they basically dictate production of it and the price of it in doing so.
So it's like the drug cartels?
No, the economic definition of a cartel is different.
Oh, is it really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't realize, I just thought the same.
I will just say this though, if any private companies form the equivalent of OPEC, everyone will be thrown in jail. It would be considered an illegal monopoly. So free trade and globalization. So research has shown that free trade increases economic growth. It reduces poverty. It leads to a lot of efficiency gains, and it promotes industrial development inside poorer countries. Globalization is the process in which the world becomes more interconnected economically and culturally. And since the end of World War II, cross-border trade has blown up. And since 1950, global poverty has actually fallen by a lot, as you can see by the graph over there. So now we talk about government incentives, tariffs, and economic development. So government initiatives such as subsidies, tariffs, quotas, and other measures can affect economic development. Government spending can have complex effects on the economy due to crowding out and through reducing public savings and investment. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and research shows that these do not actually lead to a decrease in trade deficits.
Jhon, I'm sorry, what's crowding out?
Crowding out is where an increase in government spending leads to an increase in interest rates in the economy, and that reduces private investment.
Is that happening now?
There is research supporting some level of crowding out with current U.S. spending, yes. And that basically kind of causes the issue of you're increasing government spending, but at the same time you're having knock-on effects that reduce private investment.
Okay, I'm just going to interrupt one. You can stop that, Seth, if you want.
This is one of the worst things that can happen to an economy because it affects the supply of goods and services and it affects demand in both like bad ways. So it's like the worst thing you can probably get. So government investment in infrastructure, education, and healthcare has generally led to the best results in terms of economic development, consistent with the neoclassical model. So basically, investment in education, as you guys know, has increasing returns of scale. And that is probably the biggest factor that leads to economic development within a country. So this is a unit, by the way. This is talked about on College Board. Global financial crises. So the first one we'll talk about is the 2008 global financial crisis. I could talk for probably 5 hours on this if I wanted to, but we're going to condense it. So it started in 2007 in the US and quickly spread to other countries. Causes included of the financial crisis included government subsidies for state-backed mortgage providers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, misuse of the Gaussian copula and the mispricing of mortgage-backed securities. You guys don't really need to know too much about this part. This is a lot of like mathematics involved in that. Concentration of investment bank allocation into the housing market, global savings, European banking and debt deflation. So basically, in the mid 2000s, the Federal Reserve started to increase interest rates, and that led borrowers who took out mortgages. So a lot of banks started lending out to mortgages to people who were not really good borrowers, in the sense that it was likely that they were likely going to default on their mortgages. And so a lot of them took out something called adjustable rate mortgages, where the interest rate on your mortgage varies over time. And they all increased roughly at the same time due to interest rate hikes. And that led to a lot of those borrowers defaulting on their mortgage. And that had knock-on effects in the global economy and led to a global financial crisis. And just so you guys know the scale of this crisis, you guys know about the Great Depression, right? You guys have seen like the pictures of it and like the effects. The first 12 months of the global financial crisis, by every available metric, were far worse than the Great Depression in terms of the first 12 months of what was going on. However, fortunately, we did recover a lot better than we did during the Great Depression. Additionally, we saw global asset values plummet over the course of about 9 months by over $100 trillion. That basically shows how interconnected the global economy is and how important the financial system is. 1997 Asian financial crisis. So this is an example of a balance of payments crisis and a currency crisis. So this began in 1997 in Thailand after the Thai baht. The baht is just a currency. Was forced to be floated by the central bank after running out of currency reserves. So basically what happens to Thai baht, you guys know how exchange rate works. How the exchange rate works, how those mechanisms work. All right, what determines the exchange rate between the euro and the US dollar? Do you guys know? It is determined solely by market forces. If you guys actually look up the exchange rate, you'll find that it changes every like second. Because it looks like a stock. It looks like a stock, okay?
Like a what?
Currency exchange rates kind of look like a stock in the sense that they change over time. Most of them do. A fixed exchange rate is when the government steps in and says, the exchange rate between these two currencies is this. And that basically causes it to stay the same. However, when a country fixes its exchange rate, they have to keep foreign exchange reserves on the side in order to pay out that exchange rate so they can enforce it.
Okay, an example I want you to give here. So let's say that I want to travel to Europe, right?
Yeah.
What should the exchange rate be? It should be closest to 1-to-1, right? That would help me out the most, no? Or what would give me the most bang for my buck?
It doesn't, so in terms of what the actual number is, that doesn't matter too much. What matters is the changes, and what matters is the real exchange rate. For instance, currencies can become overvalued and undervalued. So if you were traveling to Europe, you would hope that during that time, the US dollar is considered overvalued.
So a dollar, like €1 would be $1.25.
Not necessarily.
Or dollar, no, but I'm saying that's what we want. I'm trying to see when I should best go to Europe. No, seriously, if it's €1 to $1, then it's whatever I pay here, I'm going to pay there.
Not because now we're ignoring though the real cost of those products in Europe versus the real cost in the United States.
Okay.
For
sake of how much money do I take with me?
Well, generally speaking, you could look up like the cost of that stuff added up in euros. probably take like the current exchange rate and determine how much you would need to bring in dollars, probably tag along like 15% for like any currency fluctuations that
Okay.
occur midway through to play it safe, and then you'll probably be fine.
Okay,
So the thing is though, an overvalued currency or an undervalued currency, they're both bad things, and here's why. So let's say you're in a country with an undervalued currency. Your exports are cheaper, but your imports are more expensive. Vice versa for an overvalued currency. Your imports are cheaper, but your exports are more expensive. Generally, from an economic perspective, you don't want either an overvalued currency or an undervalued currency. And currency valuations actually have a large impact on foreign trade. Have you guys ever like watched the news at all and you have people saying in the United States that China devalues its currency? Have you guys ever heard about currency manipulation before? That is a very big issue in terms of international politics. So in this instance, the Thai baht was fixed and it was considered way overvalued. Most countries in Southeast Asia had overvalued currencies, and the country ran out of foreign exchange reserves, and that caused the baht to go from a fixed currency to a float overnight, and that led to a large drop in the value of the baht. So that effectively meant that imports from other countries to Thailand went up by 40%. And when your country imports a lot of food, a lot of medicine, and a lot of things of that nature, you don't want those things going up by 40% overnight, effectively. Additionally, large levels of foreign denominated debt led to real bank debt liabilities to blow up. So let's say, to explain this one the best I could, let's say Jackson, I'm from another country, let's say you're in the United States, I'm from Europe. Let's say you need to borrow money, but let's say you can't get it in the United States. So you borrow from me. And let's say the debt is denominated 100 euros. And let's say the exchange rate's 1 to 1, 1 US dollar is 1 euro. So let's say then that, so you make money in US dollars, right? But you need to pay me back in euros. So let's say then that the next day, for whatever reason, the exchange rate between the US dollar and the euro, let's say the euro sees a decrease in its value. So let's say now 1 euro is 2. Let's say 1 US dollar is now 0.5 euros. Now you have to effectively make 200 US dollars to pay me back, even though initially you only had to make 100 US dollars to pay me back fully. So when debt is denominated in a foreign currency, the real value of that debt can go up or down with currency, with how the exchange rate goes. Usually countries and firms try to avoid that by purchasing financial derivatives, but that's beside the point. But this is a real issue that a lot of countries have. If you look at what's going on actually in Turkey today, in Pakistan and Egypt today, this is actually considered a huge problem. So this led to a depegging of currencies and a substantial rise in the cost of imports. Fortunately, though, for these countries, there was a strong recovery because the economic fundamentals of each country were pretty solid. And the IMF actually went in and bailed these countries out, by the way, in order to meet payments. So Eurozone crisis. This is also called the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So this is another example of a balance of payments crisis, but this one occurred in Greece. So Greece in the early 2000s had massive budget deficits, and they were actually lying about their budget deficits to the European Union. And eventually, they ended up getting to a point where creditors would no longer lend money to them, and then they ended up effectively defaulting. And this plunged plunged Europe into a deep recession. The IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, they formed a group called the Troika, and they attempted to bail out Greece 3 times, and they included austerity measures attached to that type of stuff. And this graph shows Greek bonds and their yields. For the purposes of this explanation, the higher this is, the worse it is. For the purposes of this. So as we can see, in about mid-2010s, Greek borrowing costs shot up. So outsourcing and restructuring. As the world becomes more globalized, companies begin to outsource much of their production process overseas, taking advantage of foreign talent and labor. Cases include industrial relocation to China, Vietnam, Thailand, and other areas. And India has been a key receiver of services, where they kind of skipped the industrial process and they just went straight to the services. And this is actually one of the criticisms of Rostow's stages of growth model, because that one predicts that they industrialize and then they go to a service sector, while we see India kind of just skip the industrialization part. And do you guys know why India was a key receiver of services in terms of outsourcing?
This is a bad thing, by the way. I think it is, for us.
All the economic literature shows we benefit from it.
Well, of course, almighty dollar, but yeah, because it takes jobs
Well, it actually has led to more jobs in the service sector industry.
in that country that you're talking about.
Also in the United States.
How so?
So the thing is that in the United States, when we relocate those jobs elsewhere, we can import that, and the slack labor can then be allocated towards areas that we have a comparative advantage in.
But why is there such high unemployment?
Unemployment is actually considered extremely low right now.
Okay, I know that. Thank you, Mr. Biden, by the way. But anyway.
I would argue the low unemployment has been across ever since 2008. I mean, that was due to more sectoral changes than either Trump or Biden.
Okay, if you're in a family and there's home
Worker and your factory moved to China, that you were directly affected by outsourcing. So the cost of outsourcing are concentrated to those individuals. However, though, when a new job is effectively opened up indirectly through outsourcing, because now people can import, foreign-made products cheaper, they now have more disposable income that they can spend on whatever, and that includes U.S.-produced goods. It's easier for them to buy houses. For some people to buy houses now, it's easier to save up for that. That helps out the construction industry. That helps out the real estate industry. That creates more insurance jobs because now there's more. Because now people have to buy home insurance and such. But you can't necessarily say when, let's say, a person gets that job, let's say in the financial industry, because of outsourcing, it's hard to. They can't really notice. They say, oh, this job opened up. It's very difficult to say this was directly due to outsourcing. So the gains of outsourcing are dispersed across the entire U.S. economy, while the cost of it is concentrated to those who lost their job.
Right, because look at small town America.
Yeah.
How many small towns that had like a paper factory or had some kind of a factory that then shut down? Well, everybody in that town worked at that factory. Now it's gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
So numerically, while there were more gains from outsourcing in the United States than losses, the costs were very concentrated and the gains were dispersed across the country. And one key part of outsourcing is that also retraining that labor force that is affected by outsourcing to go into new sectors that are opened up from outsourcing. For instance, while we did see a decline in industrial jobs in the United States, we saw jobs for computer programmers and computer scientists increase. We saw a greater amount of physicists and engineers. So what we see is that as outsourcing occurs, our economy restructures towards other sectors. That's possible from that outsourcing. So some government initiatives that are taking on is to retool that labor force that gets unemployed towards those new sectors so they can get employed, so they can find jobs in those sectors to try to mitigate the effects of it.
Okay. Seth, you just stop for a second. I want to throw in one thing.
They are determined by the country, where industrial and commercial activities are encouraged through tax, regulatory, and infrastructure incentives exist. So these usually have less regulations, less taxes, less trade barriers across the country. They're generally more free market oriented and have flexible government measures. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Dubai are all cases of special economic zones. So those are areas where the government provides incentives for businesses to go in. Free trade zones. These are areas where goods can be exported, imported, and handled without the intervention of customs. Customs are basically where you go into a port and they come in, they're like, we need to inspect everything to make sure it's held up to regulatory standards. If you have any taxes and stuff that you have to pay, you'll pay them there, all that type of stuff. So these reduce the cost of trade, transportation, and cost of goods. These are created to promote economic activity and development, and were mainly utilized in China during the early 2010s to promote outsourcing from the West.
And these are vocabulary words, by the way.
Yes. Export processing zones. Regions that provide incentives to foreign companies to conduct businesses. So the difference between this and a special economic zone is that a special economic zone is for domestic and foreign companies. Export processing zones are just for foreign companies. These help facilitate foreign investment in developing countries, which assists economic development, leads to greater wages, employment, and training for those in developing countries, and leads to lower product costs in developed countries. So the multiplier effect. So the best way I could describe this is through a diagram. So imagine, like, I don't know, someone goes to the store and they buy a product. So that money then that you use to buy that product is then the company then, okay, well, what did they do with that money? They have a couple of options. They either use it to repay debt, then that money goes to the creditor, who then spends the money on something else, having knock-on effects. Or the company uses it to pay out wages to employees. The employee gets the money, they spend it on something. Or they use it to pay dividends to shareholders, which then have knock-on effects because now the shareholder gets the dividend and spends the money on something else or invested. So basically, a single source of spending can create knock-on effects in the economy. And you also have something called the financial multiplier, where this is very unintuitive, but this is where, let's say a person deposits $1 at a bank, at, let's say, a 10% reserve requirement, the amount of money that the entire financial system, the maximum that they can lend out now, is actually becomes $10. I will not explain that part, but some of it is unintuitive. Economies of scale.
This one here, I need this too.
Okay, firms have fixed cost and variable cost. So the fixed cost is, let's say, a piece of machinery. It doesn't matter how much, let's say it's like a cotton gin or something, I don't know. No matter how much cotton you put through that gin, the machine's going to cost the same because you already paid for it. That's already fixed. Fixed costs include the cost of machinery and buildings such as factories. Variable costs include the cost of the actual product and labor. So this is the materials for the product. So these depend on how much of the product you produce. These don't depend on how much of the product you produce. As production increases, the average cost of the product decreases towards the variable cost. The best way I could describe it is, okay. So let's say we have variable cost, okay? Let's say a variable cost, in this instance, let's say it's $5 per product. So let's say P, 5P. Now let's say the total cost, the fixed cost, is equal to $2,000. You guys paying attention?
Yeah.
You three, Jenny. Thank you for your attention, Jenny. So now, you guys know how to compute the average of something.
Is that a 2 or an L?
So total cost is equal to what?
John, is that a 2 or an L?
This is 2. This is 2,000.
Okay.
So total cost is equal to $2,000, right? Plus 5P. Because this is how much you produce. This is just how much you produce. That's what P stands for. Now, average total cost is total cost divided by the amount that you produce. So now we divide everything by P. So if you all want to, do you guys have your computers? Okay, well, go to your phone, type in Desmos, and put this in a graphing calculator. Just replace P with X. And what you'll find is that the graph will look like this. However, though, this point right here is not 0. It's 5.
Why?
Because this is the variable cost. So imagine you're spreading across the fixed cost among each individual product that you produce. So over time, your fixed cost per product becomes
Like low.
0. Yeah, but you're still left with 5P over P. And the P's cancel out.
Okay, I think I get that. Like, okay, an example. So if you know what we're here, this would be a good example. Jostens, okay, yearbook people. Their fixed cost is $2,000 because that's how much the printing machine costs.
Yeah.
Okay? the yearbook is $10, okay, for each yearbook that they produce.
Yeah.
Okay, so the more yearbooks they produce, the faster they will have paid off those machines, and then they make a profit.
Yes, but their average cost approaches $5. It approaches the cost of the actual yearbook itself, and not the cost of the machine. This gets more and more negligible over time.
Yeah. Okay.
But you can't really decrease your cost more than the cost it takes to produce the individual product.
Right. Okay. Do something else for me. Economies of scale. I don't know if this is even economies of scale. When I was a yearbook advisor, I always started selling the book at $50. Okay. When we first started selling it, it was $50. It actually cost us $63. That was the cost. Okay. Yeah. So we were losing money. Yeah. For every book that we sold at $50. Then the next sale we had, we went up to 55. And the next sale we had, each couple months we had a different sale. Well, the highest was $80 that it ever went. Okay, and that was like in May. So, but we sold more yearbooks that way in the $50 range, but we still broke even then.
Yeah, I would not think that's economies of scale.
Okay, what is that? Is that just stupid? I mean, because I remember Coach Berner, he used to always say, he's like, Laux, he goes, from an economic standpoint, this is terrible. I said, I know, but I want every kid to have a yearbook.
Yeah, techniques of scale are not infinite. Eventually, if you produce too much, you start to see your long-run average cost actually go up again. And that is just, and this only really applies to massive industries. And that's because at a certain point, you start actually, just by the amount of stuff that you're demanding, the actual cost of the inputs that you need start to go up just due to the sheer amount that you're demanding. So your variable costs start to rise at a certain point. But most firms never have to deal with this part. Usually you just see economies of scale until about you hit your average cost is your variable cost, and then a firm kind of just stops there usually. And this allows for a decreased cost to consumers. So this leads to lower prices for consumers. So JIT, just-in-time delivery. So this is a supply chain management strategy where goods are created and shipped that is demand timed in order to minimize inventory. This was originally done in the 1990s in Japan, and this is actually why Japan and Germany have such large auto industries. So the reason is because Japan and Germany have very good infrastructure. They have very good transportation networks, they're smaller countries, and they have great supply chain management. So what they found was originally in Japan is that, when you produce a car, let's say you're a car manufacturer, you have to have a bunch of tires, you have to have all the material, you have to have the car doors, you have to have all that type of stuff for assembly, all the engine parts and everything. So, it costs money to store that. You have to have warehouses. So some auto producers from Mitsubishi actually came along and they thought, okay, if we coordinate with our suppliers and we do a lot of market research on demand for these cars, what we can do is we can time the orders for these parts to time it with demand. And they saw that their inventory costs got reduced by 90%.
Because you don't have to store it.
Yeah. So this was originally implemented in Japan during the 1980s and early 90s in the automobile industry, leading to the rise of German and Japanese automobile makers. That's why, even though they make comparable wages to American automakers, they still kill us in terms of how well they're able to do it. And this requires excellent infrastructure coordination between suppliers, supply chain managers, and in most industries, this is rarely done. That level of coordination is rare to see, but it still is possible. Another case of JIT is also Amazon.
But wait, don't they have like these massive storehouses? I mean, these.
They can do it for some products, not all of them. So they still have to have a lot of their warehouses, but they're able to do it for some products. Okay. Usually, the more predictable the demand is for the product, usually it's easier to implement JIT with it. If demand is very unpredictable, then it's a lot harder to do.
So that's it.
So